All right, so we've managed to get our app to work and the functionality is pretty much there. But let's think more deeply about the problem. Let's look at the bigger picture. So, in this lesson, I want to talk about design patterns, app architecture, and dive deeper into Flutter state management. So, once you've started programming for a while, you'll hear these terms thrown around a lot: design patterns, architecture, state management. And the question really is, why do we really care? Why does it matter? Well, it's all down to complexity. Complexity is the root of all evil, really, in software. And here's something to illustrate that. Let's say that we decided to try and harness some energy. So we build a windmill. And every time the wind blows in UK, that's pretty much every day, then you capture the wind and you could turn that energy into milling some flour, or if you put a generator on it, then you can create electricity. Now, that's actually relatively easy to manage. And if you check YouTube and you read some books, you could probably also build one of these. But what if we wanted to scale up our production and instead we wanted to build a nuclear power plant? Now, for anybody who's watched Chernobyl, then you'll know that it is a very complex task. And there's a lot of things that you have to think about: the design of the plant, fail safes, the architecture, how things are going to be run. So, when complexity increases, the opportunities for things to go wrong also increase. And the other way to think about it is it's a bit like, say, if you decided to rent a shop space and you wanted to start a restaurant, right? It's a mom and pop shop. It's just you and a couple of cooks and a few waiters. But let's say that we told you that you had to scale up your production overnight. So instead of running a small startup, you had to run one of the largest corporations there are. So you're given a whole bunch of money to recruit and organize your staff and turn it into an Amazon or a Google overnight. You can imagine that the same rules or the same things that worked for a small company, it cannot work for a large corporation with, thousands of people working for it. So that's why different companies have different architectures, some better than others. And it's because once you get to a certain scale, once you have a certain level of complexity, then you need a good architecture to ensure that everything works smoothly and that your staff are working as efficiently as possible. So if you look at the big technology companies, you have various architectures that people have created to manage the company, like for example, a top-down pyramid where you have the CEO who delegates to managers and then middle managers and then employees, or you have other types of structures where you have, say, an individual group of employees and they all, intercommunicate. So we have the same kind of thing in software. And one of the most popular architectures, for mobile at least, is something called the Model View Controller. And this was first popularized by Apple in developing iOS apps. So the concept is really simple for this architecture. You have the model, which manages the data. You have the view, which manages what goes onto the screen. And you have the controller, who is kind of the middleman between all of these components. And so you end up with the MVC design pattern where there's the model that handles the data and logic, the view which handles the user interface, and the controller which is the mediator. So you might have a case where the user taps on something on the app. Then the code in the view will then send a message about those input events to the controller. The controller will then use those input events to decide what it should do next. And it could be that it will make a request to the model to request some data, right? Say if the user taps in a contacts app and they wanted to view Bob's phone address, then the controller is going to make that request to the model class. Now then, the model class deals with the database or the data storage, and it eventually sends back the data to the controller. The controller then uses that data to modify the view. And this is a very simplified way of looking at how the MVC pattern works. And it works well because it separates out the entire large app into separate categories where we can have specialized skills. So you'll have a department for welding, you'll have a department for laser cutting, and this way everybody knows what they're doing and they don't tread on each other's toes. Now, when we think about Flutter, though, a really important thing to consider is the difference between imperative programming and reactive programming, because traditionally native apps are built with imperative code. So it's kind of like you have a boss who tells you what to do. Today you have to, I don't know, write this report and you have to write it now. Where's that report? What's happening? But there's also the other alternative, right? This kind of utopia idea of what if the employee just knew what they had to do? What if they had a list of tasks or they had an in and out tray and they would just get on with their work, not being commanded by any particular middle manager? Wouldn't life be so much better? Well, that's kind of how reactive programming is supposed to work. And when we think about it in that way, it's kind of like we have these objects, right? Say a list view or a button. And we tell them in the beginning, as soon as we create them, well, this is your role in life. You, the button, is meant to respond to touch events. And when a user taps on you, well, this is the state that you're going to change. Or in another case where you have a text widget, well, the text widget is maybe meant to track the state of a particular variable. When that variable changes, then the text widget has to redraw, right? Reactive. So in this case, then instead of thinking about design patterns, we're thinking more about state management. How do we manage the state of the app so that we can increase the complexity of our app, meanwhile still keeping it modular and easy to manage? Now, an important thing I should say before we dive into design patterns for Flutter or architecture for Flutter or state management, if you will, is that different developers have different ideas about what is the best way of managing state and design patterns. And they feel really strongly about these things. So whenever you come across any sort of blog article or videos about state management and design patterns, you'll see people usually having a very strong idea about what everyone should use. And the important thing to remember is that there is no one way that covers all that should be used every single time. Because even if we're just talking about Flutter, there's a lot of ways that you could manage the state. And you might hear these words brandished about scoped model, provider, block, redux, mobx, and similar to how people who start learning programming always ask, well, what's the best programming language to learn? Well, there is actually no best programming language. It's kind of like if you learn how to use a hammer. Well, a hammer is a great tool, but you can't do everything with a hammer, right? You can try and, cut a piece of wood with a hammer, but the end result is not going to look very pretty. And that's the same for programming languages and state management. So at the end of the day, these different ways of managing state are just simply architectural blueprints. And there can be different architectures depending on, say, your requirements. So you might have certain design patterns or state management methods that are better because they fulfill a certain requirement of your app. So similar to architectural patterns for creating an igloo versus a tree house versus a house that needs to be on top of water, based on the different needs you have, you might use a different architectural pattern to build your house, right? Something that needs to be elevated in a tree is going to have very different architectural requirements versus something that needs to stand on a lake. Now, there's also other things that you might think about when choosing your architectural pattern, and that's style-based. And this is probably the biggest source of contention because just as, we might all have different opinions about which of these houses look the best, similarly, programmers will have different opinions based on what is the best style for creating an architecture for an app or for a program. And the final thing to remember is that there's also the maturity side to consider. Because Flutter is still quite new and it's growing and evolving, people are still working out what is the best method for managing state. So, for example, if you look at the Google I/O talk this year in Flutter state management, for most people, they recommend to use the provider package. And in order to understand how the provider package works, at least the theory of it, head over to the next lesson where we're going to talk more on that.